How do I run my next marathon faster? So I was chatting with one of my clients the other day, Eric. He's just ran his first ever marathon. He ran it in Detroit. And, I was super proud of him. He had a lot of trouble with injury leading up to it. And that's what caused him to reach out to us in the first place. And he managed to get around and get across the line. And, he was feeling very excited about it. I was really proud of him. And it was great to chat with him afterwards. But after about 2, maybe 3 minutes of celebrating and debriefing the race, he started to move on to, okay, well, when's the next time I can do a marathon? And how do I run faster? And I think we can all relate to that a little bit as runners. You hit some major milestone with your running, and then, about 2, 3 minutes of celebrating, and then what's the next goal? What's the next thing that I'm working towards? So that's what I want to talk about today. And we'll sort of center it around marathons, but it doesn't really matter. I apply this same principle, whatever you're thinking about. But we're going to talk about like how to increase your race pace. So if you just ran a marathon or if you ran one recently and you want to run the next one faster, how would you approach that? So with Eric, we started by looking at, well, why didn't he run the last one faster? So the one he just did, what was his experience during the race that meant that he couldn't run faster? What was the constraint? Now, there's always a constraint. So even Kipchoge, when he's running his, 2-hour marathons, he would like to run faster if he could. Something's stopping him, right? So there's always a constraint. And I found that generally we can divide them into these 4 buckets. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. And when you have these 4 buckets, then you kind of know what to direct your training towards in the next 3-6 months to make sure that either that's not the constraint on your next performance, or you at least do better, even if that is the same constraint, is the same problem, but you are running faster. So it's constraining you, but not as tightly. So when I asked Eric what he was feeling on race day, and he said, I felt good. I felt like I had plenty of energy. I felt like I could keep going. My breathing felt good. But my muscles hurt in my legs, particularly the quads and the front of his hips, he said, was really painful. And that was stopping him from running faster. So Eric's constraint was muscular fatigue or muscular endurance, I would call it. So that's one of the 4 constraints that we can talk about to broadly assess running performance. Now, before we get into the other 3 and talk about how you might approach addressing them, I want to just give a little disclaimer that these 4 constraints, these 4 buckets, these aren't like physiology. It's not like science. We're not sort of talking about like very specific sciencey stuff today. And performance and fatigue, this is a very nuanced and complex subject. So these buckets are far too simple, right? And they overlap and that kind of stuff. But the reason I like them is because they make it a bit simpler to know, okay, what do I need to focus on, right? So they're a rule of thumb, if you will, or a framework, a perspective on looking at your training to analyze what you need to work on. They are not the actual physiology and science of what is happening. So prior to that marathon, as I mentioned, Eric reached out to us for help because he was having trouble with knee pain specifically. So in his training, he couldn't run as far as he needed to or as often in order to build the kind of fitness he would need to do a marathon. So he couldn't even do it, never mind run it fast. So Eric's constraint at that time was pain, right? So that's the second one of the constraints. As I mentioned, for Eric, in his race, his muscle fatigue, his pain in his leg muscles, that was the thing that was stopping him. So Eric's constraint was no longer pain. In this race, now his constraint was muscular endurance. Now, in my last marathon in Edmonton, I wasn't in any pain. So I didn't have knee pain or any kind of pain that was slowing me down. My muscles felt okay, like they were a bit tired, but they were okay. They weren't what was stopping me. But as I got into sort of 10K out, 9K, 8K, I just couldn't hold the pace. I would look at my watch and think I was trying hard enough to hold race pace, but each kilometer, it was like 10 seconds per kilometer slower. So the problem was not pain. It was not muscular endurance. Those things weren't stopping me. It was just that I didn't really have the energy. I just couldn't seem to go any faster. So I call that constraint, that feeling, which may sound familiar to you, I call that energy. And then finally, the fourth constraint I call breathing. Now, it's not really breathing in the sense of like not being able to breathe correctly or enough. It's just the experience that you have. So this one would be most familiar if you do like track events, right? So I haven't done like a 100-meter race in a very long time, but I do 100-meter sprints and stuff fairly regularly. And when I run 100 meters as fast as I can, the thing that slows me down is not pain. It's not muscular soreness, right? It's not muscular endurance. It's not energy. I have enough energy to keep going, but I just can't seem to breathe fast enough. I can't seem to get enough air in to keep that pace up. So it feels like breathing, even though that's not exactly the, physiological constraint, but I call that constraint, that feeling, breathing. So to sum up, the four main constraints that you would find on your race performance would be pain, muscular endurance, energy, or breathing. And we want to choose one primary constraint, right? So Eric's was pain. Now it's muscular endurance. Mine would be energy if I was going to do a marathon in the next 6-12 months. If you were looking at like 5K races or track events, you might feel that breathing is the constraint. Like I said, breathing, not necessarily specifically the way you're breathing or anything, but that feeling of not being able to breathe hard enough. So then what we would do if we wanted to release that constraint so we could perform better in the next race is that we would target that specific constraint in our training over the next X amount of time. So let's say the next 3 to 6 months, we would target releasing that constraint in our training. So if we start with the constraint of pain, the way we would release that constraint is like we did with Eric and like I talk about on this show all the time. So we're going to address it through the 3 critical components. That means that we're going to work on building the muscles, strengthening the structures, and refining the technique, and then get the training within the adaptive zone. So his body is adapting, his knees are adapting, and then progress at the rate his body can adapt. Now, obviously, that's a very complicated subject. I'm not going to go into a great amount of detail today, but you check out a lot of my other content. That's what I talk about, is getting into this adaptive zone to get, train away the pain essentially. So if pain is the constraint, then the training is going to be specifically focused on that. And it's going to be focused around increasing tissue resilience and adaptation, as opposed to if the constraint is muscular endurance, so like it currently is with Eric. So these are some of the things that we would look at with him. What we want to do is increase muscular endurance, so muscular fatigue takes longer to happen. And there's a few different ways we can do that. Some of the ways I like to do that with the runs is to use things like back-to-back run days at the weekend, with the long run being the second run. So you might do like a long, let's say 3-hour or 30K long run on a Sunday. And on the Saturday, you do like an hour-long endurance run or an hour-long endurance run with a fast finish for the last 15 minutes. What that's going to do is you're not going to fully recover in terms of the muscular damage done by the first run by the time you start the long run, the second run. So what your muscles experience is almost like doing a 4-hour run without the injury risk that would come and the energy depletion that would come from actually doing a 4-hour run. So we almost kind of break it into 2, and we do a 1-hour run and a 3-hour run. And we're just using those amounts for the example, but it's essentially doing like back-to-back run days, with the long run being the day after a shorter run. And what you can also do is like put it in the evening. So you might put like your endurance run at like 6 or 7 p.m. and then get up early and do the long run. So you get this very big buildup of muscular fatigue that you then have to recover from, and then your body will adapt to and super compensate. So that's a really nice muscular endurance stimulus that we use often with our runners. Some of the other things that we would do, like we would definitely want to improve muscular strength, because when you make the muscles stronger, each step is comparatively easier, meaning that they will last longer. So you improve endurance indirectly by increasing strength. And we use the endurance, we would train that during the runs, and we would train the strength by doing things like heavy squats and deadlifts and lunges and that kind of stuff. And what I also like to do sometimes with people is we'll put the strength training on the morning and then an easy run in the evening. So you might do like 45 minutes of strength training in the morning where you're doing squats and lunges and all this stuff. And then in the evening, you've got like a 45-minute recovery run or endurance run. And it kind of sucks because your legs feel like jelly when you start that run because they're tired from the morning. So you're starting with a lot of muscular fatigue. So again, it's kind of giving a super fatigue stimulus to the muscles. Again, this presumes that you would then give long enough to recover from and adapt to that stimulus before you do the next run. So all of this to say, like if muscular endurance is the constraint, then our training is going to be focused around increasing muscular strength, power, and endurance. Now, let's say that the constraint was more energy. So for me with my marathon, the way I would suggest tackling it if energy feels like the constraint is lots of volume in zone 2. So like lots of easy low end running is the way to go. So for example, what you could do for me hypothetically, like you could look at what was the biggest training weeks volume wise I was doing. And let's say I was doing, I don't remember, but let's say I was doing 6 hours of running in a week, or like maybe 60, 65 kilometers. You could just double that. Like you'd have to take your time building up to that. But if I was to, for my next marathon, get up to like 12-hour training weeks, almost certainly I'm going to run faster for the same energy expenditure, right? Because I'm just going to be much more efficient. So if energy is the constraint, then doing more volume of easy running is a good way to address that if you have the time to dedicate to more hours of training. And then once you've done that, you would then, as you got closer to the race in the 1 to 2 months prior, you would do a lot of workouts that were in and around race pace to really dial in the physiological adaptations specific to that intensity. So things like lactate clearance, for example. So we would focus, further away from the race. We've got lots of low end volume. As we got closer, we're going to go more around race pace type training. And then finally, if breathing feels like a constraint, right? Like you just can't breathe hard enough, then we want to focus more on the top end speed. So that's things like sprint intervals, hill sprints, VO2 max intervals, threshold intervals, all those workouts involving intervals that involve a lot of breathing really hard, or your top end fitness. So like when your breathing feels like the constraint on your performance, if it's a 5K or something shorter, then you do more work focused in and around your top end fitness. Whereas if it's more energy, your energy feels depleted, you're going to focus more on that slower intensity, high volume training, because that's where we want to get that low end development. If you have more of a muscular fatigue, soreness problem, then you're going to focus on, increasing muscular strength and power by doing heavy lifting, long runs on tired legs, sprint work that would increase muscular power, as well as plyometric work, these kind of things to increase muscular strength and power. And then if pain is the problem, you're going to focus more on everything that's going to get rid of that pain so you can focus on your training again, which, as we've talked about, is the 3 critical components, plus getting within the adaptive zone. And then depending on what your constraint is, so just look back on your last race. What was it that was stopping you running faster? Was it pain? In which case, that's what you need to work on. Was it your muscular endurance? Were your muscles too sore, too painful to keep running as fast as you wanted to? Was it your energy? Did you feel okay, but you just kind of couldn't keep going? You just didn't seem to have the ability to keep going at that same pace. That's energy, right? Or was it the breathing? Like if it was a shorter event, could you not breathe fast enough, right? Then it's more that top end stuff that you need to look at. And obviously there's a lot of detail in how to implement all of this stuff. So hopefully it's helpful to have an idea of what might be your constraint. If you're not sure how to release that constraint and you want some help, obviously we'd love to help you with that. So as always, there'll be a link in the description. Just click it and book a call. We'll have a chat through your last race or the last couple of races. See if we can identify exactly what your constraint is. Then you can either take that and we'll give you some ideas to train it, or we can talk about what it might look like if you want our help to, specifically focus on it and release that constraint so that you can go out and start smashing new PRs.